In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, Jesus gets tempted by the devil. And yes, this is the same devil that tempted Adam and Eve in the garden. So after being baptized by the Holy Spirit, Jesus goes out into the desert and fasts for 40 days and for 40 nights. And so the devil comes to him after those 40 days and 40 nights and tempts him. But the temptations are kind of strange. The first temptation, turn these stones into bread. The second temptation of the devil, he takes him to the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem and tells him, throw yourself down from here and your angels will catch you. And then the third temptation, he takes Jesus up above and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and all the glory of them and says, I'll give you all of these if you fall down and worship me. Now, these are pretty scattered temptations. And I think if we were given these temptations, they wouldn't really fit. I mean, if the devil told me, turn these stones into bread, obviously I'd be like, no, I can't do that. But what is this temptation that he's giving to Jesus here? So let's take the first temptation. He tells to Jesus, turn these stones into bread. And Jesus said to him, man does not live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Bread in this scenario is representative of all of man's material goods, all of his bodily goods that he can receive from this earth. What the devil is tempting Jesus to do is to turn stones into bread, to use his power as the Son of God, to transform all of this earthly matter into things for humanity, to give them their material bread. Not that this is a bad thing, but this isn't Jesus' main mission. He's not here to bring some materialistic utopia on planet Earth. And if you look at modern political theories, a lot of times they're based on the premise that we're trying to pursue this materialistic utopia, this place where everyone is economically prosperous, no one is in poverty, we all have earthly bread. And not like this is a bad thing. Obviously, that's a great thing. But it's not the end of the story. We're not trying to pursue a materialistic utopia against all of man's spiritual needs, his real needs for God and for eternity. And so Jesus rebukes Satan and says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Man isn't satisfied merely with receiving just the earthly bread of material prosperity. In fact, he needs more. In fact, he needs all of that to be oriented and sacrificed for God and sacrificed to God. So the material things are meant to lead us to God, not to terminate in themselves, not to terminate in the bodily goods. And so Jesus rejects Satan's temptation. He's not going to turn Christianity merely into this materialistic utopia, much to the chagrin of many liberation theologians and Marxists. So leaving aside a materialistic utopia, the devil tempts him with the second temptation. He takes him to the pinnacle of the Jerusalem temple and says, throw yourself down and your angels will catch you and everyone will see you in the Jerusalem temple. Now, this is strange. Like, okay, why would Jesus want to make this show of himself? What is this temptation that the devil's trying to get Jesus to do? Well, it's the temptation to force God's hand to show his miracles, to show his authority, to show his mystery in the way that we see fit. The devil is tempting Jesus to tempt God to show his hand, to force him to show that he is the divine authority and you must obey and you must cower in submission. Jesus replies back, you're not to force God's providence. You're not to force God to reveal his mystery. He will reveal who he is in the way that he sees fit. And so Jesus says to Satan, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. And then we have the third and the final temptation. The devil shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and all the glory of them and says, I will give you all of these if you fall down and worship me. Now, I want you to take a second, think. What could be greater than all the kingdoms of the world and all the glory of them? Right, basically nothing. What the devil is offering is for Jesus to become the supreme, the ruler of the entire universe, the ruler of the entire world and all the kingdoms of this world, if only he would worship the devil. And think about the good that could be done if Jesus merely had worshiped the devil and all the people had been under his direct dominion, receiving their bread from Satan, receiving their bread, their material good and total prosperity, and cowering in submission to this pure mystery and pure authority. Well, what the devil is tempting Jesus to do is move from Christ to Antichrist. The Antichrist comes in his own name, takes material goods, changes it, and says, this is your bread. Makes you cower in submission before his mystery, before his authority, his miraculous ability, and finally unites all the kingdoms of the world in this kind of satanic kingdom. And notice as well that Jesus doesn't challenge the devil's claim to give him all these kingdoms. When our first parents, Adam and Eve, sinned, they made what is called a covenant with Satan. Originally, man and woman were created to be in this covenantal bond with each other and then a covenantal bond with God and all of creation. But in rejecting God, they bound themselves to the word of the devil. And this is where we have concupiscence entering in. After original sin, then we have the inclination to sin, this desire to do evil. And it is only through baptism and being united to Christ that covenant with sin, that covenant with Satan is broken. And in fact, in the baptismal oath, we reject Satan, reject all of his empty promises, all of that to reject this covenant that we have made with Satan, rather to make the covenant with Christ in freedom and truth. And so the devil does have an authority over all the kingdoms of the world. He, as the highest angel, was meant to be leading mankind to God, but rather he's been leading man away from God. So even though Christ could do all this good under this dominion of Satan ultimately, he rejects this offer of an earthly paradise, of an earthly kingdom. He rejects this earthly domination under the rule of Satan, and rather says, "Begone, Satan, for you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." In the last video, we talked about Pilate's reality confronting Christ's reality. Now we have Satan presenting this reality, this idea, this image of earthly paradise that he's tempting Jesus with. That he's saying, Jesus, if only you would do this, then man would worship you. If you flew the banner of bread, of material prosperity, if you took man's conscience and you captured it with your mystery, with your authority, and if you united all the kingdoms of the world and all the glory of them together under your reign, but under ultimately my reign, think about the good you could do. Think about the greatness that you would have in this kingdom. But Jesus rejects this because ultimately God is in control. It is God's providence that created the world, that now is redeeming it through Christ, and is ultimately going to bring it to himself in the eschaton. So Christ says, "Begone, Satan, for you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." But this isn't the last time that Satan will enter into this story. Satan will also try and tempt one of Jesus' closest companions, Judas Iscariot. If you remember, Judas as a name comes from Judas Maccabeus, who led the Maccabean revolt against the Greeks. The Greeks had set up their Antichrist, Antiochus Epiphanes, and had made the desolating sacrilege in the temple. Judas Maccabeus went on this almost suicide mission to try and conquer Jerusalem once again. And through the power of God, they were able to crush the Greeks and scatter them. So we have another Judas, one of the 12 apostles, one of the closest companions of Christ. And what were all the apostles wanting from Christ? Well, they were wanting this kind of earthly messianic kingdom. They didn't understand what he was talking about. The world and the form of this world is passing away, and the glory of it. Rather, we must embrace Christ and the cross and the church who gives us this grace. And when Christ originally says, "I'm going to have to suffer and to die on the cross," Peter rebukes him and says, "This will never happen to you, Lord." And Jesus says in reply, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are not thinking as the ways of God, but you are thinking as the ways of men." But this temptation doesn't terminate with Peter. Rather, it seeps in the heart of Judas, Judas the Iscariot. He doesn't understand why his master won't use his power, won't use his authority, won't use his mastery to lead this earthly kingdom, this messianic expectation that all the Jews were waiting for. These things about suffering and dying, of dying on a cross, are completely mysterious to him and are mysterious to the rest of the apostles. And the betrayal of Jesus by Judas, the temptation that Satan offers to Judas, is not one that Judas doesn't believe that Christ could do these things. The temptation of Judas comes out of his knowledge of Christ. He's seen Christ do these miracles. He's seen Christ raise people from the dead. He knows that Christ has this authority, has this power given him from God. Instead of allowing him to come in faith to this mystery of the cross, rather Judas tries to push Jesus' hand. Judas tries to push Christ to reveal in his own way this earthly messianic kingdom. So Judas betrays Jesus into the hands of his enemies to try and see if Jesus will finally show who he is, will show his messianic power, his messianic identity. At the Last Supper, when Jesus gives Judas the last morsel and Satan enters him, Satan now has completely hardened Judas's will to carry through his idea to throw Jesus into the hands of his enemies so that Jesus will finally reveal himself as this earthly messianic king. But the mission of Christ terminated in the cross and the resurrection, something incomprehensible for all the apostles, something incomprehensible for us today. This idea that Christ would fully embrace the suffering that was given to him, and that through the resurrection, grace would be given to us in full abundance, and we would be able to embrace the suffering in our lives, the suffering of this age, as we await the age to come. Satan's earthly dominion has been totally overcome by Christ and by his kingdom, by the graces given through his cross and through his resurrection, against the notions of the apostles and Judas early on that Christ was merely bringing this earthly kingdom and this earthly paradise. Rather, Christ was bringing the new age of grace, the age given through the suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ, and the grace given through the Holy Church. We must take care to make sure that those temptations don't become a part of what we consider to be Christianity. We must take care that we don't preach this merely wealth gospel, or this prosperity gospel, or this idea that we're going to make some type of materialistic utopia here on earth. Further, we shouldn't take the miracle of the greatest empires, of the market economics, or any of these things to replace the miracle that is Jesus Christ. And finally, we must reject as well, making Christianity this notion that can unite all the nations merely in an earthly kingdom idea. The unity of the nations is through the power of Christ, through baptism, and through the extension of the church to all the nations. So let us take to heart the responses of Christ. Let us live by the words of God. Let us not tempt the Lord our God. And finally, let us serve and worship the Lord only. Thanks so much for watching this edition of Bible Lore. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe down below and hit the notification bell so you know when new videos come up. Leave me a comment down below. I'd love to see what you thought of this video. It was quite an intense one. And give this video a thumbs up if you would. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.